The 2020 Netflix film The King with Timothée Chalamet made the 100 Years' War cool again. Now in France it's called La Guerre de Cent Ans, although the peasants who footed the bill for it at the time
It's almost harvesting season!
probably had a different name for it. Now in this video I don't want to talk about
this little village of Agincourt,
but rather about the later period in the 100 Years' War and why the French were later on able to turn the tide and defeat the English. But before that, this video is sponsored by Xbox Game Pass for PC.
What's this then, eh?
You can get access to new and upcoming PC releases like Crusader Kings 3, Halo Master Chief Collection and Wasteland 3 and many more. In the library there are hundreds of games and you can even start for just $1 a month and explore all of these PC games and start playing today. This is a great way to play many games on a budget. Today I'm being sponsored by Crusader Kings 3, which is a new game set in the Middle Ages and you can go around trying to create the best dynasty you want using spies and intrigue, or just try and inbreed your family to make even the Habsburgs' chin wobble. It's an absolute must for fans of medieval games. Check out the link in the description below to help support my channel and go over and check out the Xbox Game Pass for PC. The first month is just $1, so please check it out. As you'll know, today Britain and France are ruled by different monarchs. In Britain we have good Queen Lizzie, Elizabeth, and in France we have... oh yeah. Not anymore. But let's go back to the year 1415, which is the start of the Lancastrian phase of the 100 Years' War, which is when Henry V with his army destroyed a French army at Agincourt. Now while they went home, they did actually return to France, and over the next few years they conquered lots of northern France. So by the time that Henry V died of dysentery in 1422, his armies had conquered very large parts of Picardy, of Normandy, and other provinces in the north of France. Now unfortunately his son, Henry VI, was
a child.
Luckily for the English, however, he had several key advisors who were great tacticians, like the Earl of Salisbury, the Duke of Bedford, and the Earl of Shrewsbury. Now, in 1428, however, the French finally also got a hero. The French had popped up a vein and the English were about to get a full dose of this heroin. Joan of Arc led the French forces at the siege of Orleans and rallied them in some way to fight back against the English more effectively, and was able to break the siege of Orleans, but more importantly she gave new morale to the French forces that were fighting in France against the English. To make matters worse for the English, not only had they been beaten by the Maid of Orleans, but their leader, the Earl of Salisbury, also succeeded in the noble and ancient art of catching a cannonball, and so he was killed. Now things got even worse because actually the cannons are a very important point for the French victory in the 100 Years' War. Now early on both sides had used cannon, but it's at this point that the French really started to invest in more modern artillery at the time. Now it's still pretty rustic, and this image is the first showing of Europeans using artillery in a European manuscript, and it's from the siege of Orleans. And actually later on during the 100 Years' War, when the French started to retake all these cities and fortresses and castles that the English had taken in northern France, their artillery managed to reduce their walls in a number of days, whereas beforehand it would have taken the French much longer to storm the English castles. As well, in field battles they would become more important as well, as they started to fire balls not made of stone but of metal, which were much more effective and would be used to great effect against English armies and English castles. Now the man who was responsible for some of these reforms and more, which I'll talk about in just a little bit, was Charles VII, the Dauphin of France, and Charles VII would become very important for the French struggle against the English. Now, after the siege of Orleans, the English retreated away from the city, but they were caught by the French army at the Battle of Patay. Now this was a very important battle because the French vanguard caught up to the retreating English, and while many of the knights were able to get away, many of the longbowmen, which had been so devastatingly effective at Agincourt, were not. And to make matters worse, John Talbot, the Earl of Shrewsbury, was captured at the battle. Now it's important not to understate how important the Battle of Patay was, because a smaller French army managed to defeat the retreating English for the first time in a very long time in France, and the Battle of Patay to the French was what the Battle of Agincourt had been for the English a little bit earlier on. Now in 1430 things seemed to be looking up, because the Burgundians, the allies of the English, captured Joan of Arc and sold her to the English. The English, upon inquiry, heard that she'd been hearing voices from God and said, "Ding dong, your religion is wrong," and burnt her at the stake. Now in 1435, representatives of England, France and Burgundy, Burgundy being England's biggest supporter in their war against France, met at a town called Arras. And they talked about how to bring the war to an end, but these talks went nowhere because Henry VI was unwilling to give up the claim to the French crown, and the French, of course Charles VII, would declare himself King of France, and so he couldn't allow Henry VI to become king and to keep that claim, and that's why they were still fighting this 100 Years' War. And actually the English had to storm out in the middle of this meeting because there were 2 French mercenary commanders mounting a raid against them. But the discussions between the French and the erstwhile allies of the English, the Burgundians, carried on, and this led to the Treaty of Arras. But wait, I hear Flemish rumbling in the distance, because Arras, that should actually be Atrecht, because this town was initially a Flemish-speaking town, and therefore is rightful Dutch clay. All jokes aside, 1435 was a critical year in the 100 Years' War and a great turning point for the French, because this marked the changing alliance of the Burgundians, who had fought with the English for many years against the French, to switching sides and joining the French. And you can see just by looking at the map how this tactically changed things for the English in northern France. Now, this also was a terrible year because the Duke of Bedford, that great commander and brother to Henry V, died in 1435, and so the task would go on to other regions to look after the throne. And even though Henry was of course coming of age himself at this point, Henry VI, he was not a good commander by any stretch of the imagination and wasn't that interested in the war in France. Now, there's a very interesting book called Conquest, which is about the English kingdom of northern France, and Juliet Barker here talks about how the French, during the period after 1435, when there was a brief truce, managed to reorganize their military. She said, "In future, no one could claim to exercise military authority without royal approval. All captains were to be chosen by the king and held responsible for the discipline of their men, whose misdeeds they were authorized to punish. Any action against civilians would be treated as treason, and property, livestock and agricultural produce were to be protected. A fixed levy of 1,200,000 livres, approximately £70 million of today's money, was to be imposed annually on the king's subjects to pay for the royal army, which in future would live in garrison rather than on the land. The combined effect of these ordinances was to outlaw freelance companies and create a single royal army subject to the control of the Constable of France, Arthur de Richemont." This was not only monumental for European history because it was the first time since the Romans that there had been a permanent standing army of this type in Europe, but also for the French because it changed them from looking responsible for mercenary captains that would go around and would have men and they would kind of loosely fight for the French, but if the Burgundians or the English offered them a better price, they could always go over, to having actually a decent army in the field, and an army in the field at all times that was being paid for by the taxes of the peasants rather than just a war tax, which was what the English were doing at the time. This was bolstered in 1445 by the Compagnie d'Ordonnance, which further simplified the army and actually got rid of a lot of the excess of the men that perhaps weren't so good. What it also meant was that actually they got a better relationship with the French peasants that they were fighting for. And this was incredibly important because the English, who did not have this, faced many revolts in Normandy, Picardy, Maine and other areas of northern France because the peasants would rise up against them. And even though at this point we can't really speak of a French identity versus an English identity as much as we can today, that did start to play into it. And certainly if we look at the linguistic situation, this is because the French had a huge advantage because, well, they spoke French. So this royal French family and the armies that fought for them could actually communicate with the local population, which made things an awful lot easier. Whereas the English...
Away with you, vile beggar!
I don't understand because my English is very bad.
This was alongside the fact that the English weren't recruiting directly from France, but had to recruit their soldiers in England and then pay to transport them over to northern France to fight the French. Of course, England had a smaller population than France did at that point as well, which also plays into the whole war. and financial worries were becoming a really big issue for the English because they had to garrison all these towns in northern France, whilst the French were starting to make more money, especially with the fact that the Burgundians, who had a very lucrative wool trade, were also now on the side of the French. Now in 1449, the capital of Normandy, Rouen, fell to the French, and the French had been steadily advancing, encroaching on this northern kingdom within France that the English had captured with their artillery, taking down these heavy walls and using their new professional full-time army to beat the English, who were still having to recruit armies on a kind of seasonal basis whenever they could get the funds together for new campaigns in England to raise longbowmen and men-at-arms. And really it wasn't working for the English at this point. The French were out fighting them, and this is really the end of that kingdom in northern France. The fall of Rouen was really the beginning of the end. Now, one of the last battles that was fought there was the Battle of Formigny, and this was a very important battle because actually the English came very close to winning this, but another different duchy in northern France, that of Brittany, who were in the northwest of France, were also now allies of the French, and the Breton cavalry was able to surprise the English force that actually inflicted quite some damage on the French and completely break that army. And that was really the last English army in northern France that was broken. And so you can see that apart from Calais, which remained English for a very long time, all of northern France, apart from the Channel Islands, had been retaken. Now in 1451, the French mounted their assault against Gascony. Now Gascony had come under many attacks before, but in 1451 there was a breaking point because the French were able to capture the city of Bordeaux. However, in 1452, this next year, actually that old hero John Talbot, who was the Earl of Shrewsbury, who had been freed from captivity, was able to recapture the city of Bordeaux. And this was the last hurrah of the English in France, because in 1453, the French once again made a move on Bordeaux, and at the Battle of Castillon, John Talbot too joined that noble and ancient sport of cannonball catching. Along with his son, this new artillery was revolutionary for this battle and completely blew the English away in more ways than one. And so Bordeaux, that last stronghold in Gascony, fell to the French, and Calais remained the last of the English holdings in northern France that had once been this grand empire that had largely been captured by Henry V in the early 15th century. Now Calais would remain in English hands actually for over a century after this, until 1558, when it was lost by Mary Tudor. I actually have a video on Mary Tudor that I made ages ago to help myself when I was learning for A-levels, which you can watch here if you're interested in finding out about why and how Calais was lost in 1558. But some people actually regard that the 100 Years' War had a first phase, which is what I've just talked about, but a second phase. It's unofficially called the Second 100 Years' War, which is about all these other fights that have been between Britain and France, although I kind of don't really buy into this. It's a different dynamic when they go to war after this. It's more that they're two imperial powers and they butt heads. Already you see this in Henry VII's reign, for example, with the Breton crisis and the Battle of Etaples, and also in Henry VIII's reign and the Tudors, and then on with the Stuarts and all of this, and that some actually don't consider it to have ended until Waterloo, which is 1815, although personally I don't think this is a good argument because the English never tried to invade France properly again. They never really had that ambition, and actually Edward IV, who was one of the Yorkist kings, actually gave up the title of the King of France because he was at peace with the French. Alright everyone, so thank you very much for watching this video on the 100 Years' War and why the French were eventually victorious against the English, because I don't think I've really covered it that often on this channel. I've made a few videos about the 100 Years' War, but largely about the earlier phase of the Lancastrian period of the war. The Lancastrian period is the period with Henry V and then with Henry VI afterwards. Now of course England after the 100 Years' War was thrown into turmoil itself, and it had the Wars of the Roses between two rival houses, that of York and that of Lancaster, and I've made a lot of videos about that you can find in the description below, and if you go back on my channel videos, and on the Tudors who kind of come out of that. So I hope you found this interesting. Do check out the deal in the description because it is a really cool one, and I also have a video coming out with one of my favourite YouTubers, Koifish, so very very excited for that one. But thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this quite memey video. I thought I'd throw in quite a few because of a special occasion. And I hope to see you all again soon. So this has been Hilbert and... Wait, no. I am Hilbert and this has been The History.